Welcome to this presentation of new research on innovations in applications of interRAI assessments. My name is Keir Johnson from Doctors Manitoba, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Our presentation today will include three panelists who are experts and who are collaborating on the disaster and emergency management applications of interRAI assessments. We will begin with a presentation by Dr. John Hurdes. John is a professor in the School of Public Health Sciences at the University of Waterloo and the Senior Country Fellow for interRAI Canada. He serves on the interRAI Board of Directors, and he's chair of the interRAI Network for Mental Health. John will be joined by Dr. Nigel Miller. Nigel is also an interRAI Fellow, and he's from Christchurch, New Zealand. He is a geriatrician with 18 years of experience as Chief Medical Officer in previous roles with the Canterbury and Southern District Health Boards in New Zealand. Our third panelist is Dr. Gustavo Bettini. Gustavo holds a PhD in ecology, but he is currently completing a second doctoral degree on climate change, mental health, and aging at the University of Waterloo. We will provide a web link to this research at the end of today's webinar. John, over to you.
Thank you, Keir. It's great to be here today with our audience to speak about interRAI's assessment systems and how they can be used in emergency management, and in particular to talk about our vulnerable persons at risk scale, which is an important decision support algorithm that can inform decisions through all stages of disaster management. The starting point for this work was the European heat wave of 2003, where many people died. There were 15,000 deaths that happened after France, for example, was hit with 40 degrees Celsius temperatures for more than 7 days. But those deaths particularly occurred among older persons and persons who were socially isolated. When you take a look at the epidemiological literature, what we see is that there was a lack of mobility was a major risk factor, pre-existing medical conditions was important, and so was a lack of insulation in the home. When I saw that research, it raised a question for me of whether interRAI could have helped in that context. In Canada, we have widely implemented the interRAI home care instrument, and this has been true in several other countries. And the advantages of something like the interRAI home care is, well, we've already done the research on the psychometric properties. We know that these instruments are valid and reliable. They're also highly clinically relevant in the sense that they're designed to support care planning and outcome measurement at the individual level. They're done by trained clinicians. The data from these assessments are recorded on robust automated computerized systems with backup methodologies, so those data are readily available. And the assessments are done by or done on everybody in a covered area where it's been mandated. So for example, in Ontario, over 200,000 people are assessed per year with the interRAI home care instrument. And that is a live real-time data system. It gets updated daily. The data are fully identifiable to the agency. So the agency using the assessments can identify the names, addresses, and geocodes for persons who have been assessed. And those data are also exportable to partner agencies that may be involved in an emergency response, for example. Also, people are reassessed regularly, so these data are updated on a regular basis. And in Canada, the data are managed on a national basis by the Canadian Institute for Health Information. So this gives some interesting health infrastructure for the information systems that might be needed for use of data in an emergency response. So that brings us to the Christchurch, New Zealand earthquake that happened several years ago. This was an important disaster that resulted in loss of life and damage to infrastructure. It was also important to us in the interRAI world because New Zealand is a country that's implemented several interRAI instruments, and we have several colleagues that are actively doing work in New Zealand. So we're all concerned about the well-being of our colleagues. At the time of the earthquake, Bridget Meehan, was one of our colleagues, was leading implementation of the National Home Care Instrument and Contact Assessment within New Zealand. Nigel Miller, who's joining us today, was the Chief Medical Officer of Health in the Canterbury District Health Board. He was on the ground in Christchurch when this happened. And then Andrew Downs was the head of IT for the agency implementing the RAI home care. So when the earthquake happened, we came into contact with our colleagues and asked about their well-being. And Nigel made the point of interRAI needing to do work on disaster management applications of interRAI systems. So the four of us got together to come up with an idea of how we may be able to answer the information needs at the time of the earthquake. So within 24 hours, we were able to assemble a basic decision support algorithm and mobilize the data to help with the emergency response to the earthquake. The colleagues in New Zealand were able to use those data in a variety of different ways, including managing the transfer of about 300 seniors out of the earthquake zone at that time. But when we looked at the algorithm that we created collaboratively for the New Zealand earthquake after the fact, we realized, well, there were things that needed to be improved in it. The algorithm seemed useful at face value, but it could be refined. It had not been tested statistically, so we needed to refine it because the triggering rate for the algorithm was too high. And also we needed to think about how we could validate the decision support algorithm for targeting individuals more effectively during a disaster. So Sandy van Zoom did her PhD with me at the University of Waterloo to take on this task of refining the algorithm, and we worked in collaboration with other colleagues in Red Cross Canada, WHO, and CIHI to refine this algorithm further. The end result was the vulnerable persons at risk scale, which had several different components. It differentiated people based on the presence of impairment and things in terms of things like the cognitive performance scale, the chest score, vision impairments, physical disability, IEDL impairments with things like managing medications and managing meals, and the need to use a wheelchair. We also looked at social isolation because you remember from the France heat wave that people who were isolated were particularly vulnerable. So we use indicators like living alone or being alone for most or all the time, not having a primary caregiver, with being withdrawn from social activities and having reduced social interactions are important. We also looked at vulnerabilities for the caregiver to the home care client in terms of caregiver distress or pervasive conflict in the family. We added an additional component that wasn't in the previous epidemiological research, but was important in the sense of folks who are dependent on technology could be vulnerable during the context of a disaster as well. So from Sandy's PhD work, this is what the algorithm looks like in terms of its distribution among Ontario home care clients. It divides people into low, medium, and high priority groups. Depending on which variant of the algorithm you use, the high priority group includes about 25% of people. If you don't include the wheelchair, oxygen, and dialysis use, if you include those in the high priority group, it goes up to about 38%. But what this is saying is in the context of an emergency, these are the 25 to 38% of folks that you must contact first because they're at most risk during the disaster. And you can use this to organize your response in terms of who you see first, second, and third in this overall vulnerable population. When Sandy did the comparison of this to mortality prior to any kind of a disaster, we found that the algorithm, both variants, worked very well for differentiating mortality risk. The medium risk group has an odds ratio of about 1.7 times greater for mortality compared to the reference group. If we look at the algorithm that includes the dialysis use, wheelchair use, and oxygen use, the high risk group then has double the odds ratio compared to the reference group for risk of mortality outside the context of a disaster. At the time that Sandy was doing her dissertation work, we had a major event in Ontario. We had an ice storm that knocked out the power in the Toronto area for over a week and affected 250,000 customers in the Toronto area that were left without electricity of any type for that prolonged period. So we were able to use this algorithm to see, did it work in the context of that disaster? And what we saw was that for people who were exposed to that ice storm event based on geocoded information, the algorithm predicted increased hazard rates for death for the exposed at the medium and high risk level compared to those at the low risk levels, and compared to those not exposed to the disaster, the magnitude of risk was expanded. So given that the VPR algorithm can work to differentiate risk levels, it's worth thinking about how does this compare to other strategies like creating disaster preparedness registries. The challenge with those current registries is they're not based on scientific research. They're often just created based on best guesses at what might make sense to include in those registries. They don't link to national standards like the CII standard in Canada for interRAI data holdings. They miss many vulnerable persons who are not part of the registry. The data in those registries are often out of date very rapidly because they don't get updated. They make the vulnerable person do the work to get registered in the registry, and they cost additional funds to set up and maintain over time. The advantage of the interRAI approach is that the algorithm is based on science, so I've just shown you some of that work. It's based on the existing interRAI standard for the home care assessment system. It covers everybody assessed with the interRAI home care or the interRAI community health assessment or CHOP. It's automatically updated every time a reassessment is done. It doesn't require additional effort by the person who's been assessed, since the algorithm is calculated automatically. And there's no major additional cost for implementation because it's just software code that reuses data that are already gathered under existing practice patterns. So interRAI has a multi-pronged information strategy that we can offer for emergency response, including the ability to target populations that need immediate follow-up during a disaster. We can have an expanded monitoring system for people at moderate risk of mortality, both for the event itself and for ongoing stress related to the event and relocation. We can support continuity of care by transmitting interRAI assessments from one care partner to a receiving agency that may take over care for people who've been evacuated. It can be used to manage the care of people who are being evacuated and the evacuation process itself to decide who to move and when and how they might be moved. And it can be used in post-emergency evaluation to see what the consequences or what the strategies were that were effective or ineffective in emergency evaluation. So our colleague Vince Moore did work to evaluate the approaches used to manage the response to Hurricane Katrina using interRAI data as an example. So that's where we've come to. I'm happy to now join the panel and come back to Keir to answer some questions about this work.
I loved that presentation, and it unfortunately feels like it's becoming too topical too often as we see more disasters happening around the world. So you ended by talking about some of the advantages of the interRAI vulnerable persons at risk algorithm or scale over conventional approaches and registries. And I wonder if you could just expand a little bit. What needs to be done for regions using interRAI systems already to start using the VPR?
Well, there's not that much more that needs to be done. Certainly not more that needs to be done in terms of data collection, because the algorithm itself comes from the assessments that are already done. So the huge cost investment has already been made for getting the data. So the things to be done include working with your software vendors to be sure they have the algorithm embedded within their software. It's actually a licensing requirement from interRAI that vendors have that capability. But probably the trickiest bit is to work through the consent and information sharing processes. So when a disaster strikes, you need to be able to have the information go from the home care agency, say, into the hands of first responders who may be involved in the disaster management or other partners in it. So there has to be a consent mechanism put in place so that we know that the data can be used in that way should the event occur. So there are privacy and consent considerations that need some effort, but those aren't particularly difficult to overcome and are more policy processes rather than technical or human resource challenges. And then it's just a matter of sort of incorporating it into practice and building it into disaster planning strategies. It's a tool there that's ready to be used.
And what about vulnerable persons who have not been assessed with interRAI systems? How could we support those individuals?
Well, first of all, everybody that's assessed would include home care clients or other populations that were being assessed in similar ways in the home care setting, which is a large fraction of that vulnerable population. But there are certainly folks, as you mentioned, that would not yet be getting home care assessments, but may have complex needs, say, that are being served in primary care contexts. In that case, an option that might be available is to use the interRAI checkup assessment. It's a self-reported tool that can be used very easily in primary care settings with fairly low intensity in terms of the resource requirements for it. And that checkup tool also has the interRAI VPR algorithm embedded in it. Or if you were to set up a supplementary registry, it would make sense to have that registry use interRAI measures in it so that everything is compatible and measuring things in the same way.
Great, thanks. I'd like to bring in Dr. Nigel Miller from New Zealand. Of course, Dr. Miller has some firsthand experience of needing to figure this out during an emergency situation. So as the Chief Medical Officer in Christchurch at the time of that infamous earthquake, you have a unique perspective. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how interRAI helped in the response during the Christchurch earthquakes, and what difference did that make for you as a chief medical officer, and ultimately how did it benefit the vulnerable persons being affected by that disaster?
Thank you, Keir. First, a little bit of background. This all stemmed from an offhand comment in an email to John, who very kindly inquired whether I was okay, and I said we need assessment for disasters, and I heard no more. That was just a sent it off. And then, to my surprise, 24 hours later, arrived in my email box a list of all our home care clients ordered by level of risk. I was just blown away. One, we realized we weren't on our own, and resources could be marshaled to support our local response in other parts of the world or other parts of our country. It was an extraordinary example of rapid response. So in a disaster, like an earthquake that's disseminated, affecting many people, one tends to jump to the idea of first responders, but that's not what happens. Support is provided at a very local level by community groups, organizations and agencies that normally work in the community. Now, when you're involved in the main level decision making, you have very limited information. Information is like gold. You don't have a lot of time to stop and find information. So having this level of information allows good decision making around prioritizing certain areas for response, because you might find there are concentrations of people in certain places, to provide that information to community support groups, community support agencies, so they can see amongst their clients where the priorities are. They know where to find them. So a lot of things happen at a very local level that we will probably never actually know the details of, but we're able to give that information and make it available across the sector. And this is particularly important. It gives people confidence. They know where to put their energies, rather than knocking on 100 doors to find one person who's at risk, which is the sort of comparative model. We'd thought about this before the earthquake because we'd done a lot of emergency planning, and we'd seen the things that happened in New Orleans, where older people were really badly affected and whole rest homes were abandoned. So we never wanted that to happen. So we put an extra arm into our emergency response, which is vulnerable people. So they already had a plan for vulnerable people, and we were able to give them this information, which they grasped immediately, and were able to use it to support the response.
So you kind of talked about this already, but I wanted to delve into why it's important to have information about vulnerable people in disasters and emergencies. And I think what you just said that really resonated with me is vulnerable persons are not a homogenous group. And so when you add that arm in and you think about the data from interRAI and how it can support community response and all that, how is that information important in an actual emergency response when it came time to respond during the earthquake?
Well, for example, you may have an older person who's very dependent at home, isolated from their family may be elsewhere in the country. Now, what you have is a service agency will be very stretched, but they can recruit their neighbors and say, can you help? Because this is, disaster response, the initial response is always done by the people themselves. So finding a way to help people do something useful, because everyone wants to help. Everybody wants to do something. Everyone has the same mission. So it's just a matter of enabling as many people as possible to enact that mission. John talked a little bit about the privacy issues. Yes, they are relevant, but when it's a life and death model like this, in fact, in New Zealand, the privacy commissioner relaxed the rules around privacy to make it easy for these things to happen.
And what about the aftermath? So often, whether it's just watching about a disaster on the news or other places, people really do focus on that immediate disaster stage. But of course, the aftermath or the recovery phase usually isn't short and usually has its own challenges. So how can this type of information about vulnerable persons be used during that recovery stage?
Well, when a disaster happens, not the first thing you do, but one of the things you do very early is set up the recovery team with the recovery manager. So you start thinking about recovery before you've even finished the response. And the response can be quite long, but usually it's relatively short. So then you get into recovery, and that's a range of things. First of all, it's planning on a large scale. So then you have that information to aggregate, to look at the depth of the problem, how many people you're going to need to support, what different supports they need. You can look at it on a micro level. For example, if somebody has a front drive that they can't walk down where they previously could because they have some disability walking, then that becomes those sort of things can be a priority. You can look at options to understand the needs of individuals, groups of people, and then the whole community. So your planning process around recovery is well informed.
That's great. And where I'm from in the middle of Canada, we don't have a lot of disasters that strike with little to no warning. Our biggest disasters are often floods that you can see coming for weeks with lots of forecasts. They're not generally flash floods. Wildfires, which still have some preparation time. So I imagine even in a preparation stage before a disaster strikes, that something like this could also be useful.
Yes, absolutely. It enables people, first of all, to be alerted to the risk for their family members. So when you know someone is at risk, family members have options to support them to have some sort of preparation in place. Looking for the things that'll be difficult. If you feel the electricity is going to be lost, what's the plan that people can make to get through that? What supports might they need during the time there's no electricity? So you have things marshaled beforehand, and you know particularly where people are, but in this case, where the priority should be. Because it's all right having a list of all the people being served by an agency, but they won't have the time to go through them and sift out the ones that are important. But if you can provide that to them, it simplifies their work considerably.
So I'd like to bring in Dr. Gustavo Bettini to this conversation, and of course, with a background and expertise in climate change, and I think we're learning that the increase in many of the disasters that we're seeing are climate related in some way. I wonder if you could talk about why climate change is a particular concern for older adults and vulnerable adults.
I think there are two main factors that we need to take into account. One is the fact that climate change, as you mentioned, is increasing the frequency of these events, right? So we're going to see more, we're going to see more wildfires, heat waves, floods, droughts. So as we see from John's and Nigel talk, these events, they disproportionately affect older adults. So we know from the disaster literature that both physical and mental health of older adults are at risk during these events. We know that mortality and morbidity are high among older adults, for example, during a wildfire or a heat wave. So that's one aspect. The other thing is I think, much more simple, is because we are experiencing an aging population in many parts of the world. So we're going to have more people in that age group, the age group that's actually at higher risk during these events. So more people in the next few years are going to experience these negative health and mental health outcomes.
And one of the things that I really love and admire about interRAI as an organization is just the diversity of expertise that they draw in and utilize to ultimately make their tools better and to better serve vulnerable people around the world. So, criminology and as it turns out, ecology with you, Gustavo. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that ecological perspective and how we can leverage your expertise to enhance the use of interRAI systems to respond to emerging healthcare challenges.
Yeah, the interRAI system provides a number of information about the individual, about the client, important information such as the clinical condition, mental health state, and a number of other individual level information. The ecological perspective can actually tell us more about the environment, which the interRAI instruments don't tell us too much about the environment that the client lives in. So by combining the environmental data with the interRAI data, we will be able to first better understand what makes older adults vulnerable to these climate change events. And second, if we understand these factors that increase their vulnerability, we will be able to actually predict and develop instruments that can tell us who are at the higher risk during, for example, a heat wave or a wildfire. So I think that these are the main contributions of that ecological perspective.
That's great. This reminds me of kind of where I started my career in healthcare about 20 years ago in home care, working as a bit of an analyst with interRAI data. And there was, it wasn't a disaster or emergency, but there was a big part of the city that was suddenly without water. And it wasn't an evacuation situation, but home care was asked to identify the people who were most at risk to try and, look at evacuating them or getting them resources. And so we quickly fork, knife, spooned through, interRAI indicators and thought, well, how could we figure out these people? I'm learning now I should have just emailed John when in doubt to get the list if he has it. But to see this kind of a scale develop now, this vulnerable persons scale, is really interesting. And it makes me think about what we could have done with it in that moment. And I'm sure so many moments since here and around the world. So I guess a question, and I'll start with you, John, and certainly invite Nigel and Gustavo to chime in if they'd like. What do you think the next stage of research is that could be done in this area?
I think the next step is refinement and generalization and testing of the algorithm and its framework in a variety of different contexts and disasters. One of the things that I like about interRAI is we don't stand still in our work. We keep refining our tools as we get more evidence. And one of the things that's true today compared to when the Christchurch event happened or the Toronto ice storm happened is we have more interRAI data that happen in the context of different types of disasters. So in Canada, we've had wildfires, as you've mentioned. There was a heat dome that happened in British Columbia. There were floods that happened in Calgary, and we had a major hurricane event just in the last few months that affected the east coast of Canada. In all those jurisdictions, interRAI assessments are used. They weren't at the time employing the VPR algorithm, but we can use those data to do further testing of, well, are there different patterns of survival that happen for different subgroups that we need to think about, or were there different adverse outcomes, whether they be mental health or functional decline, that we can take a look at. There are also different types of disasters that may require somewhat different data elements. So with respect to the heat dome, there it might be that we also need to look at the quality of the housing environment, where we do have questions on the adequacy of heating and cooling in the home that could be informative there. So we will continue to do the refinements here. I would also sort of make the point that all of this work has a very strong, clear fit with some of the classic gerontological literature. Many years ago, when I was a graduate student, I read Powell Lawton's foundational work about person-environment fit, where it talked about elderly people and the environmental pressures that are placed on them. And you need to think about the ability of the person to respond to those environmental pressures, to think about their well-being. This is very much along those lines. It's looking at identifying the most vulnerable people that cannot handle much perturbation in terms of the risks posed by an environment during emergencies or disasters. So it's exciting to be able to collaborate with colleagues like Nigel and Gustavo to drive this further.
So can I comment on this? I suppose it would be along the lines of translational or action-based research we're looking here, because sadly there will be more disasters. So the wider the implementation of the scale, the more info we get back. But even then, what we should be doing is looking, afterwards, what were the important things, how predictive it was, what were the things we're missing, because we have all that other data to look at. And then the second part is to look at how we can strengthen people's resilience ahead of time using the things we've identified. These are the people that have problems, but also these are the things you can think about to become resilient, and then create an action-based, transitional model. We can't do random trials. You can't do randomized trials of earthquakes because they're not really predictable. But we must find a way to continually refine, as John said.
And Gustavo, would you like to have the last word on this question?
Yeah, I think I'm quite excited about the idea of developing predictive tools to understand who are these people more vulnerable to climate change events. I think if this is going to go through understanding about what makes them vulnerable first. But as a PhD student, I have a very pragmatical problem, which is actually make the link between the interRAI data and the environmental data. And that seems to be a simple problem, but actually it's not. There's a number of problems that we're going to face, such as scale. interRAI data is collected at the individual level. Weather data is in weather stations that sometimes at the local level, provincial level. We also have problems with privacy that we mentioned before. We want to protect the privacy of these people, and geospatial data might increase the chances of identifying these people. So we have technical issues and also ethical issues that we need to address. But for me is the idea of using statistical methods, machine learning methods to develop predictive tools that can tell us where these people are that are at higher risk during a climate change event.
Thank you. And I'd like to end with just, and it might be a little repetitive, but back to John, the practical question, whether you're in Canada or New Zealand or Chile or China or South Africa or Sweden or anywhere else in the world, a disaster could just be around the corner. And now is a good time to make sure you've got this tool available, not during the disaster. So once again, in 2 or 3 sentences, what should people do to start now getting ready for when they need it?
Do the administrative work to be sure that all the procedural things are taken care of in terms of the data sharing and privacy considerations. Get that stuff out of the way. But the other very practical thing that can happen right now is to apply the VPR algorithm to your planning information with geospatial information, so you know where the vulnerable people are that are at risk. So one of the things that was exciting that Sandy Van Zoon did after she finished her PhD is she worked with the public health department in the Waterloo region to map out the Waterloo region in terms of flood zones in the Waterloo region, and to place people with high VPR scores that lived in those flood zones on that map for public health to use, so that in advance they knew if a flood's going to come, I've got somebody that can't get out of their homes and doesn't have somebody watching out for them living right there in that flood zone, so that you're ready. So if the event comes, you don't have to, run the code and hope that it comes to you on time. You already have it at your fingertips and it's ready to go.
So almost the idea of running a drill,
Yeah.
doing it now before you need it, so you're ready to go when you need it. And that also incorporating that information, like you mentioned, into some of your planning once you know how many and where and so forth. So that's great. I'd like to thank Dr. John Hurdes, Dr. Nigel Miller, and Dr. Gustavo Bettini for joining us for this presentation today. I found it very interesting and very practical and timely. So thank you very much for that. And thank you for joining us today. Thank you for watching this presentation on interRAI's research related to disasters and emergency management. If you would like more information about this and related work, you can contact us at info@interrai.org. That's info@interrai.org.
If you would like to learn more about interRAI's Vulnerable Persons at Risk algorithm, please follow this link for the scientific article published in the Journal of Emergency Management.